A racist neighbor named Ms. Griffin plants drugs on an innocent black boy, John, hoping to get rid of the black family in the neighborhood. Soon after, the police rush to John's door and arrest him. Will justice be served? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A black boy named John Harris stepped out onto the front porch of his modest suburban home, taking in the warm morning sunshine. At 12, he was already known throughout the neighborhood for his kind heart and helpful nature. The fresh scent of newly mowed grass filled the air as he gazed down the quiet street lined with neat houses and well-tended gardens. "John, honey," his mother's voice called from inside. "Don't forget to take out the trash before you go." "On it, Mom," John replied, his voice warm with affection. Ms. Cynthia Harris appeared in the doorway, her work uniform already on, and her hair neatly tied back. Despite the early hour, her eyes sparkled with love as she looked at her son. "What would I do without you?" she said, pulling John into a quick hug. John smiled, breathing in the familiar scent of his mother's perfume. "Probably drown in garbage," he joked, earning a playful swat on the arm. As John wheeled the trash bin to the curb, he noticed Mrs. Johnson, their elderly neighbor, struggling with her own bin. Without hesitation, he jogged over to help. "Let me get that for you, Mrs. Johnson," John offered, his voice gentle and respectful. The old woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh, John, you're such a dear, thank you." John easily maneuvered the bin into place, then turned to Mrs. Johnson with a warm smile. "No problem at all. Is there anything else you need help with?" Mrs. Johnson patted his arm affectionately. "You're a good boy, John. Your mother must be so proud." John felt a swell of love for his mom. She had raised him alone, working long hours as a nurse to provide for them. Despite the challenges, she had always made time to instill in him the values of kindness and respect for others. As if on cue, Ms. Harris appeared at their front door, her bag slung over her shoulder. "John, I'm heading out now. Don't be late for school." John waved goodbye to Mrs. Johnson and hurried back to his mother. Ms. Harris cupped his face in her hands, her eyes shining with pride and love. "You're growing up so fast," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you, sweetheart." John hugged his mother tightly. "I love you, Mom. Have a good day at work." As Ms. Harris drove away, John watched her go, feeling a mix of admiration and gratitude. He knew how hard she worked, often taking extra shifts to make ends meet. Yet she never complained, always greeting him with a smile and a warm meal when she came home. John headed back inside to get ready for school, his heart full of love for his mother and the peaceful life they shared in their little corner of the world. As the weeks passed, John continued his routine of helping neighbors and spreading kindness throughout the community. However, not everyone appreciated his presence. Ms. Martha Griffin, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down from John, watched the young boy's activities with growing unease. Ms. Griffin sat on her porch, her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she observed John helping Mrs. Johnson with her groceries. Her wrinkled hands clutched the arms of her rocking chair, knuckles white with tension. "There he goes again," she muttered to herself, her voice laced with suspicion. "Always hanging around, pretending to be helpful. I don't trust it one bit." Ms. Griffin's prejudices, long harbored but rarely voiced, began to surface more frequently. She found herself peering through her curtains whenever John walked by, her heart racing with unfounded fear. One afternoon, as John was mowing Mr. Peterson's lawn, Ms. Griffin approached her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. "Have you noticed that Harris boy?" Ms. Griffin asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. "He's always lurking about, getting into everyone's business." Mrs. Thompson looked confused. "John, he's just being helpful, Martha. He's a sweet boy." Ms. Griffin shook her head vehemently. "Don't be fooled, Margaret. I've seen his type before. They start off all nice and friendly, then before you know it, things start going missing." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in shock. "Martha, that's a terrible thing to say. John's never done anything wrong." But Ms. Griffin was undeterred. Her prejudices, fueled by years of isolation and misinformation, had taken root deep within her. She began to see threats where none existed, twisting John's acts of kindness into something sinister in her mind. As days went by, Ms. Griffin's suspicions grew. She started keeping a notebook, jotting down every time she saw John in the neighborhood, creating patterns out of innocent coincidences. Her once peaceful life became consumed by an irrational fear of the kind-hearted boy next door. John's sneakers scuffed against the sidewalk as he made his way to Ms. Thompson's house, his arms laden with grocery bags. The sun beat down on his dark skin and sweat beaded on his forehead, but a warm smile lit up his face. He loved helping his neighbors, especially the older folks who struggled with everyday tasks. "Ms. Thompson," he called out cheerfully as he approached her porch, "I've got your groceries." The elderly woman appeared at the door, her face creasing with joy at the sight of John. "Oh, bless your heart, John. You're such a dear for helping me out." As John carefully carried the bags inside, Ms. Griffin peered through her lace curtains, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She watched as John moved back and forth from Ms. Thompson's car to her house, her gnarled hands clutching the fabric tightly. "Always poking around where he doesn't belong. I bet he's casing the joint, looking for valuables to steal." Her mind raced with unfounded fears and prejudices. She imagined John rifling through drawers, pocketing jewelry, or worse. The fact that he was simply helping with groceries didn't register in her biased mind. "They're all the same," she continued her internal monologue, her lips curled in disgust. "Can't trust any of them. First, they move into our neighborhood, and next thing you know, crime goes up. It's happening all over the country." Ms. Griffin's heart pounded as she watched John chat amicably with Ms. Thompson on the porch. To anyone else, it would have been a heartwarming scene of intergenerational kindness. But to Ms. Griffin, it was sinister and threatening. "He's probably sweet-talking the old fool," she thought bitterly, "trying to find out when she'll be away so he can break in. Well, I won't let that happen. Someone's got to protect this neighborhood from his kind." As John waved goodbye to Ms. Thompson and started walking back to his own house, Ms. Griffin's eyes followed him, filled with unwarranted suspicion and fear. Her prejudices had twisted her perception so severely that she could no longer see the kind-hearted boy for who he truly was. Ms. Griffin's wrinkled hands shook as she dialed the number scrawled on a crumpled piece of paper. Her heart raced, but she steeled herself, convinced that her actions were justified. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" I need to make a purchase," Ms. Griffin whispered, her voice trembling. "It's for a good cause." The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "Lady, I don't care what it's for. What do you want?" Ms. Griffin swallowed hard. Something illegal, drugs, enough to plant on someone. As she arranged the meeting, Ms. Griffin's mind raced with rationalizations. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she told herself. She was protecting her neighborhood, her friends, her way of life. That boy, John, was a threat. She just knew it. The next day, Ms. Griffin found herself in a dingy alley, clutching her purse tightly. A hooded figure approached, and her heart nearly stopped. "You got the money?" the man growled. With shaking hands, Ms. Griffin pulled out an envelope stuffed with cash, her life savings. The exchange was quick, and before she knew it, she was hurrying home with a small bag of white powder tucked in her purse. Back in the safety of her living room, Ms. Griffin stared at the bag on her coffee table. Doubt crept into her mind for a moment. Was she really doing the right thing? But then she remembered John, always hanging around, always so helpful. It had to be an act, she was sure of it. "I'm sorry it has to be this way," she murmured to herself, her voice quavering. "But someone has to take a stand. Someone has to protect our homes." As she formulated her plan to plant the drugs on John, Ms. Griffin felt a mix of fear and determination. She was crossing a line, and she knew it. But in her twisted logic, it was a necessary evil. She would be the neighborhood's unsung hero, saving them all from a threat they couldn't see. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, Ms. Griffin peered out her window. Her heart raced as she watched John, his youthful figure silhouetted against the fading light, make his way to Ms. Thompson's house. The elderly woman's groceries needed carrying again, and as always, John was there to help. Ms. Griffin's gnarled fingers clutched the small bag of white powder. This was her chance. With a deep breath, she slipped out her front door, the packet hidden in her cardigan pocket. Her joints ached as she hobbled across the street, glancing nervously over her shoulder. John's backpack lay innocently on Ms. Thompson's front porch, abandoned while he assisted inside. Ms. Griffin's hands trembled as she approached it. She fumbled with the zipper, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the whole neighborhood could hear it. "It's for the greater good," she whispered to herself, trying to quell the guilt rising in her chest. With a quick movement, she slipped the bag into a side pocket of John's backpack. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the worn fabric. Was she really doing this? The sound of laughter from inside the house startled her. Ms. Griffin quickly zipped the backpack closed and hurried back across the street, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. Safe behind her curtains once more, she watched and waited. Minutes ticked by like hours. Ms. Griffin's palms were slick with sweat as she saw John emerge from Ms. Thompson's house. He waved goodbye, his smile bright even from a distance. That smile sent a pang of doubt through Ms. Griffin's heart. John slung his backpack over his shoulder, completely unaware of its dangerous contents. Ms. Griffin held her breath as he started down the sidewalk heading home. With each step he took, the knot in her stomach tightened. As John disappeared around the corner, Ms. Griffin sank into her armchair, exhausted and conflicted. What had she done? The weight of her actions pressed down on her, and for the first time, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. As night fell over the neighborhood, Ms. Griffin paced her living room, her conscience warring with her misguided sense of duty. The weight of what she had done pressed heavily upon her, but her prejudices still held firm. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the police. "Hello, police. I'd like to report something," she said, her voice quavering. "There's a boy in our neighborhood. I've seen him with drugs. His name is John Harris, and he lives at 1423 Maple Street." Ms. Griffin's heart raced as she provided the details, her voice disguised and her number blocked. The dispatcher assured her they would investigate immediately. As she hung up, a mix of relief and dread washed over her. Across the street, John sat at the kitchen table, laughing with his mother as they shared a simple dinner. Ms. Harris beamed at her son, proud of the kind young man he was becoming. Neither of them had any idea of the storm that was about to break over their peaceful home. The screech of tires on asphalt shattered the evening calm. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows, casting eerie shadows across the Harris family's living room. John's fork clattered to his plate as he jumped up, startled by the sudden commotion. "What's going on?" Ms. Harris asked, her voice tight with worry as she moved to the window. John's eyes widened as he saw 2 police cars parked in front of their house. "I don't know, Mom," he said, fear creeping into his voice. A sharp knock on the door made them both flinch. Ms. Harris took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she went to answer it. John hung back, confusion and fear etched across his young face. As Ms. Harris opened the door, she was met by 2 stern-faced officers. "Good evening, ma'am," one of them said, his voice gruff. "We've received a report about illegal substances in your home. We're here to conduct a search." John's world seemed to tilt on its axis as he heard the officer's words. He looked from his mother's shocked face to the grim expressions of the police, unable to comprehend what was happening. As the officers stepped into their home, John felt a chill run down his spine, unaware that his nightmare was just beginning. The police officers moved swiftly through the Harris home, their eyes scanning every corner. John and his mother stood in stunned silence, watching as their peaceful evening crumbled around them. "We need to check your son's room," one officer stated firmly. Ms. Harris nodded, her voice shaky but determined. "Of course, but I assure you there's nothing to find. My son is a good boy." As they entered John's room, the second officer zeroed in on his backpack. With gloved hands, he unzipped it and began to search. John's heart pounded in his chest. Confusion and fear etched across his face. Suddenly, the officer's hand emerged from the bag, holding a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "What's this?" he demanded, his eyes hard as he looked at John. John's mouth fell open in shock. "That's not mine," he cried out, his voice cracking. "I don't know where that came from." Ms. Harris gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "There must be some mistake," she pleaded, looking frantically between her son and the officers. But the evidence was damning. With heavy hearts, the officers informed John of his rights and placed him in handcuffs. Tears streamed down his face as he was led out of his home, his mother following close behind, her own cheeks wet with anguish. As they stepped outside, John saw their neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. Whispers and shocked gasps rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed disbelief and sympathy, while others wore looks of judgment and fear. Ms. Thompson, the elderly neighbor John had helped earlier, pushed her way to the front. "This can't be right," she exclaimed. "John is a sweet boy. He helps me all the time." But others weren't so sure. One neighbor shook his head, muttering, "You never really know someone, do you?" As John was placed in the back of the police car, Ms. Harris stood on the lawn, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked at her neighbors, her eyes pleading for understanding and support. Some turned away, unable to meet her gaze, while others offered small nods of encouragement. In the midst of the chaos, Ms. Griffin watched from her window, a mix of triumph and unease swirling in her chest. She had set her plan in motion, but as she saw the pain on John's face and the devastation in Ms. Harris's eyes, a tiny seed of doubt began to take root in her heart. John sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the metal table. The harsh fluorescent lights made his eyes ache, and the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't understand how this had happened. One moment he was at home, and the next, he was being accused of something he knew he hadn't done. Outside, Ms. Harris paced the waiting area, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "Please, we need your help immediately," she pleaded with the lawyer on the other end. "My son has been wrongfully accused. He's innocent, I know it." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she fought to keep her composure. She had to be strong for John. As the lawyer assured her he would be there soon, Ms. Harris glanced through the window at her son. Her heart broke seeing him look so small and vulnerable in that big, intimidating room. She wanted nothing more than to rush in and wrap her arms around him, to tell him everything would be okay. But for now, all she could do was wait and fight. Meanwhile, across town, Ms. Griffin sat in her living room, staring blankly at the television. The news was on, but she wasn't really watching. Her mind kept replaying the events of the evening, the look of shock on John's face, the anguish in Ms. Harris's eyes. A part of her felt satisfied that her plan had worked, that she had protected her neighborhood. But another part, a growing part, felt a gnawing sense of guilt. "I did the right thing," she whispered to herself, trying to drown out the doubts creeping into her mind. That boy was trouble. I just know it. But even as she said the words, they felt hollow. The image of John being led away in handcuffs kept flashing before her eyes, and each time it did, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. Back at the police station, John wiped away tears with the back of his hand. He wished his mom was there with him. He wished he could go back in time and never leave the house that day. Most of all, he wished someone would believe him when he said he was innocent. Mr. Bennett arrived at the police station, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a determined set to his jaw. As soon as he saw Ms. Harris, he quickened his pace. "Ms. Harris," he said, reaching out to shake her hand, "I'm so sorry you're going through this. Let's sit down and talk about what's happened." Ms. Harris nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. They found a quiet corner in the waiting area, and Mr. Bennett listened intently as she recounted the events of the evening. "John would never do something like this," Miss Harris insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's a good boy. He helps our neighbors. He gets good grades. This is all just a terrible mistake." Mr. Bennett nodded, his expression serious. "I believe you, Miss Harris. Now, I need to speak with John. Can you tell me where he is?" Ms. Harris pointed towards the interrogation room. Mr. Bennett stood up, straightening his tie. "I'll do everything in my power to help your son," he assured her. Inside the interrogation room, John looked up as Mr. Bennett entered. The lawyer's heart went out to the boy, who looked so small and scared in the harsh light. "Hello, John," Mr. Bennett said gently, taking a seat across from him. "I'm Mr. Bennett, your lawyer. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" John's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to speak. "I didn't do it, Mr. Bennett. I swear. I don't know how those drugs got in my backpack. I've never even seen drugs before, except on TV." Mr. Bennett listened carefully, jotting down notes. He asked John about his routine that day, about his neighbors, about anyone who might have had access to his backpack. As John spoke, Mr. Bennett's conviction grew. This boy was telling the truth. There was more to this story, and he was determined to uncover it. "John," Mr. Bennett said, leaning forward, "I want you to know that I believe you. We're going to fight this together, okay? I promise I'll do everything I can to clear your name." For the first time since his arrest, John felt a glimmer of hope. He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. Mr. Bennett stood up, gathering his notes. "I'm going to start investigating right away. Stay strong, John. We'll get through this." Mr. Bennett sat at his desk, poring over the police report. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages, making notes and circling inconsistencies. Something wasn't adding up. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The more he looked at the evidence, the more convinced he became that John was innocent. But if John didn't put the drugs in his backpack, who did? Mr. Bennett picked up his phone and dialed Ms. Harris. "Ms. Harris, I've been reviewing the case, and I have some questions. Can you tell me if any of your neighbors have security cameras?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, yes," Ms. Harris replied. "Mr. Johnson across the street has one. He installed it after his car was broken into last year. Why do you ask?" Mr. Bennett's heart raced with excitement. This could be the break they needed. "I think it might help us prove John's innocence," he explained. "If we can see footage from that day, we might be able to catch whoever planted the drugs in John's backpack." Ms. Harris gasped. "You mean, you think someone set him up?" "I do," Mr. Bennett said firmly. "The evidence doesn't add up. John's story has been consistent and nothing in his past suggests he'd do something like this. I believe someone planted those drugs and I'm going to prove it." "Oh, thank goodness," Ms. Harris breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew my boy was innocent." Mr. Bennett's determination grew stronger. "I'm going to reach out to Mr. Johnson right away. With any luck, his camera caught something that can help us clear John's name." After hanging up, Mr. Bennett immediately drafted a formal request for access to Mr. Johnson's security footage. His fingers flew over the keyboard, outlining the importance of the footage to John's case. As he finished the letter, Mr. Bennett felt a surge of hope. He couldn't shake the feeling that this security footage could be the key to unraveling the whole mystery. With a deep breath, he hit send on the email to Mr. Johnson, hoping that this would be the first step towards justice for John. Mr. Bennett sat in his office, his eyes glued to the computer screen. The security footage from Mr. Johnson's camera played before him, showing a clear view of Ms. Thompson's front yard. His heart raced as he watched the events of that fateful day unfold. There was John, helping Miss Thompson with her groceries just as he'd said. Mr. Bennett leaned closer, scrutinizing every detail. And then he saw it, his breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with hesitant steps. It was Ms. Griffin, her face twisted with determination. She approached John's backpack, which sat innocently on the grass. With trembling hands, she unzipped it and slipped something inside. "Got you," Mr. Bennett whispered, his voice barely audible. He rewound the footage, watching it again and again to be certain. There was no doubt. Ms. Griffin had planted the drugs in John's backpack. With shaking hands, Mr. Bennett reached for his phone. He dialed Ms. Harris's number, his heart pounding with excitement. "Ms. Harris?" he said as soon as she answered. "I have good news. Great news, actually." "What is it, Mr. Bennett?" Ms. Harris's voice was hopeful but cautious. "I've just reviewed the security footage," he explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It shows everything. Ms. Griffin, she's the one who planted the drugs in John's backpack. We have proof of John's innocence." There was a moment of silence, then a choked sob. "Oh, thank God," Ms. Harris cried, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew my boy was innocent. I just knew it." Mr. Bennett smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "We have what we need to clear John's name," he assured her. "I'm going to start preparing our case right away. We'll present this evidence to the police and the prosecutor. John will be home soon, Ms. Harris, I promise you that." As he hung up the phone, Mr. Bennett felt a renewed sense of purpose. He turned back to his computer, ready to build the strongest case possible for John's innocence. Ms. Harris's hands trembled as she set down her phone. Tears of relief streamed down her face, but a storm of emotions brewed inside her. She looked at John, who sat quietly on the couch, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "John, baby," she said softly, her voice cracking. "Mr. Bennett found proof. It was Ms. Griffin who planted those drugs in your backpack." John's eyes widened, a flicker of hurt crossing his young face. "Ms. Griffin," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But why? I've always been nice to her." Ms. Harris moved to sit beside her son, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. She could feel him trembling beneath her touch. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people, they let their fears and prejudices guide them. It's not right, but it happens." John's shoulders slumped, the weight of betrayal settling heavily upon him. "I thought she was my friend," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I helped her with her garden last summer. How could she do this to me?" Ms. Harris felt a surge of anger coursing through her veins. She wanted to march over to Ms. Griffin's house and confront her, to demand answers for the pain she had caused her son. But she knew that wasn't the right way to handle this. "I know it hurts, John," she said, gently stroking his back. "But we need to stay calm and let Mr. Bennett handle this. He knows what he's doing." John nodded slowly, but his mother could see the struggle in his eyes. The hurt, the confusion, the sense of betrayal. It was all there, threatening to overwhelm him. "It's okay to feel angry," Ms. Harris continued, her voice soft but firm. "What Ms. Griffin did was wrong, but we can't let that anger control us. We need to stay strong and trust in the truth." John looked up at his mother, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How can I ever trust anyone again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Harris's heart ached at her son's words. She pulled him closer, resting her cheek on top of his head. "Not everyone is like Ms. Griffin, John. There are good people in this world, people who will stand by you and believe in you. Remember how Mr. Bennett fought for you? How Ms. Thompson always speaks kindly of you?" John nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Stay strong, baby," Ms. Harris whispered, her voice filled with love and determination. "We'll get through this together. The truth will come out, and you'll be free. Just hold on to hope, okay?" The police station buzzed with activity as Mr. Bennett presented the damning footage to the chief. Officers gathered around, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as they watched Ms. Griffin plant the drugs in John's backpack. The police chief, a stern-faced man with graying hair, leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "I can't believe this," he muttered, shaking his head. He turned to one of his deputies. "Get John Harris as innocent immediately, and bring Ms. Griffin in for questioning." As the officers scrambled to follow orders, Mr. Bennett felt a wave of relief wash over him. He pulled out his phone to call Ms. Harris with the good news. Meanwhile, at the Harris home, John and his mother sat in tense silence waiting for any news. When the phone rang, Ms. Harris nearly jumped out of her skin. She answered with shaking hands, her voice trembling. "Hello?" Mr. Bennett's words brought tears to her eyes. "They're releasing John. The police saw the footage. It's over." John watched his mother's face, hope blooming in his chest as he saw her expression change from worry to joy. She hung up the phone and pulled John into a tight embrace. "You're coming home, baby. You're free." As word spread through the neighborhood, a flurry of reactions swept through the community. Neighbors gathered in small groups on their lawns, talking in hushed tones. Some expressed outrage at Ms. Griffin's actions, while others found it hard to believe. Ms. Thompson, the elderly neighbor John had often helped, sat on her porch, tears in her eyes. "I knew that boy was innocent," she said to anyone who would listen. "John's a good kid. He didn't deserve any of this." Across the street, another group of neighbors argued heatedly. "But why would Ms. Griffin do such a thing?" one asked, his voice filled with confusion. "It's clear as day," another responded, her voice sharp with anger. "She couldn't see past her own prejudices. It's shameful." As the sun began to set, a police car pulled up to the Harris house. John stepped out, looking tired but relieved. Ms. Harris ran to meet him, enveloping him in a tight hug as neighbors watched from their windows and porches. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, 2 police cars pulled up in front of Ms. Griffin's house. The flashing lights bathed the neat, well-kept lawn in an eerie blue glow. Inside, Ms. Griffin sat in her living room, unaware of the commotion outside. The television droned on in the background, but her mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the guilt of what she had done. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. With trembling hands, she rose and made her way to the entrance. As she opened the door, she found herself face to face with 3 stern-faced police officers. "Ms. Martha Griffin?" the lead officer asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Ms. Griffin nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have a warrant for your arrest," he continued, holding up an official-looking document. "You're being charged with planting evidence and making false accusations against John Harris." The color drained from Ms. Griffin's face as the reality of the situation sank in. But I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer shook his head. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officers led Ms. Griffin to the waiting police car, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Whispers and gasps rippled through the growing crowd as they watched the elderly woman being placed in the back of the police car. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Johnson from across the street muttered, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "Martha's lived here for decades. How could she do such a thing?" Mr. Patel, who lived next door to Ms. Griffin, shook his head in disappointment. "Fear and ignorance can make people do terrible things," he said softly. As the police cars drove away, leaving a stunned neighborhood in their wake, the reality of what had transpired began to sink in. The community that had once seemed so peaceful and united was now in turmoil, grappling with the revelation of the prejudice that had been lurking beneath the surface. John stood on the front porch of his home, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The familiar sight of the worn welcome mat and the potted plants his mother lovingly tended to felt strange now, as if he were looking at them through a foggy window. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. "John, honey, is that you?" Ms. Harris called from the kitchen, her voice warm and comforting. "Yeah, Mom," John replied softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Harris emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of relief and concern as she took in her son's slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. "Oh, baby," she said, wrapping John in a tight embrace. "It's over now. You're home, and the truth has come out." John nodded against his mother's shoulder, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. As they pulled apart, Ms. Harris cupped his face in her hands, her eyes searching his. "I know this has been hard on you," she said gently, "but remember, the truth prevailed. You did nothing wrong." John tried to smile, but it felt forced. "I know, Mom, it's just—" He trailed off, unable to find the words to express the turmoil inside him. Ms. Harris led him to the couch, sitting down beside him. "What is it, sweetie? You can tell me anything." John stared at his hands, twisting them in his lap. "It's the way everyone looked at me," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Like I was dangerous. Like they didn't know me at all." Tears welled up in Ms. Harris's eyes as she listened to her son's pain. "Oh, John," she whispered, pulling him close again. "And now," John continued, his words muffled against his mother's shoulder, "I don't know how to face them. What if they still don't believe me? What if they're still scared of me?" Ms. Harris stroked John's back, her heart aching for her son. "Some people might still have doubts," she admitted softly. "But that's their problem, not yours. You know who you are, John. You're kind, honest, and good-hearted. Nothing can change that." John nodded, but the weight of isolation still pressed heavily on his shoulders. The neighborhood that had once felt like an extended family now seemed like a place full of strangers, their suspicious glances and whispered conversations replaying in his mind. The courthouse bustled with activity as the day of Ms. Griffin's trial arrived. People from the neighborhood filed into the courtroom, their faces a mix of anger, confusion, and sadness. John sat with his mother in the front row, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As Ms. Griffin was led into the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched and her eyes darting nervously around the room. When her gaze met John's, she quickly looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. The judge called the court to order and the trial began. The prosecutor presented the evidence against Ms. Griffin, including the damning security footage that showed her planting the drugs in John's backpack. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the video played. John felt his mother's hand tighten around his as they watched. The memory of that day, of being arrested and doubted by his neighbors, washed over him anew. He blinked back tears, trying to stay strong. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the community was divided. Some of Ms. Griffin's longtime friends sat on her side of the courtroom, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. Others glared at her, their anger palpable. When it was time for Ms. Griffin to take the stand, she moved slowly, as if each step was a struggle. Her voice quavered as she spoke, admitting to her actions but struggling to explain why she had done such a terrible thing. I was afraid," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I let my fear and my prejudice cloud my judgment. I convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was so wrong." John watched as Ms. Griffin broke down on the stand, her shoulders shaking with sobs. He felt a confusing mix of emotions, anger at what she had done to him, but also a twinge of pity for the scared, misguided woman before him. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. Some people nodded in understanding, while others shook their heads in disgust. The divide in the community was clear, and John realized that no matter the outcome of the trial, healing the neighborhood would be a long and difficult process. As the trial continued, Ms. Griffin's defense attorney tried to paint her actions as a misguided attempt to protect the neighborhood. He argued that she was an elderly woman who had made a terrible mistake out of fear and confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney said, his voice smooth and persuasive, "Ms. Griffin is not a criminal. She's a longtime member of this community who simply lost her way." But Mr. Bennett, leading the prosecution, was not about to let Ms. Griffin's actions be brushed aside. He stood up, his face set with determination. "Fear and confusion do not justify framing an innocent child," Mr. Bennett said firmly. Miss Griffin's actions were not just misguided. They were malicious and rooted in deep-seated prejudice. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Mr. Bennett called witness after witness. Neighbors testified about Ms. Griffin's past comments and behavior, revealing a pattern of bias that shocked many in the room. Ms. Thompson, the elderly neighbor John had been helping, took the stand. Her hands shook as she spoke. "John is a kind boy who has always been there to help me," she said, her voice quavering. What Ms. Griffin did to him was cruel and unjust. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire community. People packed the courtroom every day, and those who couldn't fit inside gathered outside discussing the case in hushed tones. Local news reporters camped outside the courthouse, their cameras capturing the comings and goings of key figures in the trial. The case had become a sensation, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and fear. John sat through it all, his mother by his side. He watched as his neighbors took sides, as friendships strained under the weight of differing opinions. The trial was exposing rifts in the community that had long been ignored, and John realized that no matter the outcome, things would never be quite the same. As the trial continued, Ms. Harris was called to the stand. She took a deep breath, smoothing her skirt as she sat down. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on the woman who had been through so much. "Ms. Harris," Mr. Bennett began gently, "can you tell us how these false accusations have affected you and your son?" Ms. Harris nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's been devastating," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "John is a good boy. He's always been kind and helpful. To see him treated like a criminal, to watch him be arrested in front of our neighbors, it broke my heart." She paused, taking a moment to compose herself. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "John hasn't been the same since," Ms. Harris continued. "He's withdrawn, scared to leave the house. He doesn't trust anyone anymore. My boy, who used to light up a room with his smile, now barely speaks above a whisper." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Many of the spectators looked down, shame evident on their faces. "And for me," Ms. Harris said, her voice growing stronger, "it's been a nightmare. I've had to watch my child suffer, knowing he was innocent but feeling powerless to help him. I've lost sleep, lost weight. I've seen neighbors I've known for years look at me with suspicion." She looked directly at the jury, her eyes filled with determination. "But what hurts the most is knowing that someone in our community, someone we trusted, could do this to an innocent child, all because of the color of his skin." The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. Even Ms. Griffin, sitting at the defense table, couldn't meet Ms. Harris's gaze. "We've lived in this neighborhood for years," Ms. Harris said. "We've been part of this community, and in one moment all of that was taken away from us. John's innocence, our sense of belonging, our trust in our neighbors, all of it, shattered." As Ms. Harris spoke, the judge listened intently, his expression softening. It was clear that her words were having a profound impact on everyone in the courtroom. As Ms. Harris finished her testimony, the courtroom remained silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. The judge nodded solemnly, thanking her for her candid account. Suddenly, a choked sob broke the silence. All eyes turned to Ms. Griffin, who had slumped forward in her seat, her shoulders shaking. Her lawyer tried to calm her, but Ms. Griffin shook her head vigorously. I can't do this anymore," she cried out, her voice trembling. "I did it. I planted those drugs in John's backpack." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his eyes wide with surprise. "Ms. Griffin, are you aware of what you're saying?" Ms. Griffin nodded, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Yes, Your Honor. I was scared. I let my fear and my prejudice cloud my judgment." She turned to face John and Ms. Harris, her eyes filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." The courtroom remained deathly quiet as Ms. Griffin continued her confession. "I've lived in this neighborhood for decades. When John and his mother moved in, I felt threatened. I didn't understand why. I let my old fears take over." Her voice broke as she spoke. "I convinced myself that John was dangerous, even though he was nothing but kind. I bought those drugs and planted them in his backpack. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was just being a hateful old woman." Ms. Griffin's shoulders sagged as the weight of her actions seemed to physically press down on her. "I've hurt an innocent boy. I've torn this community apart. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you all to know how deeply sorry I am." The silence in the courtroom was palpable. John and Ms. Harris sat stunned, their eyes wide as they watched Ms. Griffin's breakdown. The judge, visibly moved by the unexpected turn of events, called for a brief recess to allow everyone to process what had just occurred. The courtroom reconvened, a tense silence settling over the room as everyone awaited the judge's decision. Judge Anderson cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "Ms. Griffin," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "your actions have caused immense pain and suffering to John Harris and his mother. You've torn apart the fabric of your community with your prejudice and deceit." Ms. Griffin nodded, her eyes downcast and filled with shame. "However," the judge continued, "your confession and apparent remorse have been taken into consideration. I hereby sentence you to 6 months in prison. followed by 2 years of mandatory community service focused on promoting diversity and inclusion in your neighborhood. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. John and his mother exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering hurt. Judge Anderson addressed Ms. Griffin once more. "I hope this time will allow you to reflect on your actions and work towards becoming a better member of your community." As the bailiff approached to lead Ms. Griffin away, she turned to face John and Ms. Harris one last time. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John met her gaze, his young face etched with a complexity of emotions. He didn't speak, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ms. Harris placed a protective arm around her son's shoulders as they watched Ms. Griffin being led out of the courtroom. The elderly woman's shoulders were slumped, her future now as uncertain as the community she had left in turmoil. As they stepped out of the courthouse, John and his mother were met with a flurry of reporters and concerned neighbors. Ms. Harris shielded John from the cameras, guiding him towards their car. "It's over now, baby," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We can start to move forward." John nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah, Mom," he said softly. "But it's not going to be easy, is it?" Ms. Harris squeezed his shoulder, her eyes filled with love and determination. "No, it won't be. But we'll do it together, one day at a time." As they drove home, the weight of the ordeal still hung heavy in the air. The road to healing would be long, but at least now they could begin to walk it. 6 months passed, and Ms. Griffin emerged from prison a changed woman. Her once proud shoulders now slumped with the weight of her actions, and her eyes carried a haunted look. As part of her sentence, she began her community service at the local community center, helping with various programs aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion. One sunny afternoon, as Ms. Griffin was organizing donated books for the center's library, she heard familiar voices approaching. Her heart raced as she looked up to see John and Ms. Harris standing in the doorway. "Ms. Griffin," Ms. Harris said, her voice calm but firm, "we'd like to talk to you." Ms. Griffin nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she set down the books. "Of course," she replied softly. They moved to a quiet corner of the room, sitting around a small table. John's eyes were fixed on the floor, while Ms. Harris's gaze never left Ms. Griffin's face. "We need to know," Ms. Harris began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Why did you do it? Why did you try to ruin my son's life?" Ms. Griffin took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at John, who finally met her gaze. The pain and confusion in his young eyes broke her heart all over again. I was wrong," Ms. Griffin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was so terribly wrong. I let my fear and prejudice control me. I convinced myself that I was protecting the neighborhood, but really, I was just afraid of what I didn't understand." She paused, wiping away a tear. "John, I am so deeply sorry for what I did to you. You didn't deserve any of it. You're a kind, helpful young man, and I let my ignorance blind me to that." John nodded silently, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ms. Griffin continued, her voice filled with shame and regret. "I know I can never fully make up for what I did, but I want you both to know how sorry I am. My actions were inexcusable, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Ms. Harris took a deep breath, her eyes softening as she looked at Ms. Griffin. "Thank you for your honesty," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What you did caused us a lot of pain and suffering, but we can see that you're truly sorry." John, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. His voice was soft, but there was a strength behind his words. "I was really hurt by what you did, Ms. Griffin. I couldn't understand why someone would do that to me when I've always tried to be kind to everyone." Ms. Griffin nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, John, and that's what makes it even worse. You were nothing but helpful and kind, and I repaid that with cruelty." Ms. Harris reached out and placed her hand on John's shoulder. "We've talked about this a lot, John and I, and we've decided that holding on to anger and resentment will only hurt us more." John nodded, meeting Ms. Griffin's eyes. We want to forgive you, Ms. Griffin. It's not easy, but we hope that you'll learn from this and become a better person." Ms. Griffin's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected forgiveness, especially not so soon. I don't know what to say. Thank you both. I promise I'll do everything I can to change and to make amends." The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Ms. Harris smiled softly. "That's all we can ask for. We all have room to grow and learn." John, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, added, "Maybe you could come volunteer at the youth center sometime. We could work together and show others that people can change." Ms. Griffin nodded eagerly, wiping away her tears. "I'd like that very much, John. Thank you for giving me this chance." As they stood to leave, there was a sense that something had shifted. The wounds weren't completely healed, but the process of forgiveness had begun, opening the door to a future where understanding could replace fear and prejudice. Ms. Griffin arrived at the community center for her first day of service, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around the bustling room, filled with people from all walks of life. Her heart clenched with a mixture of fear and resentment. "Welcome, Ms. Griffin," said Mr. Johnson, the center's director. "We're glad to have you here. Let's start you off in the kitchen, helping prepare meals." Ms. Griffin nodded stiffly, following him to the back. As she donned an apron, she couldn't help but feel like this was beneath her. She chopped vegetables mechanically, avoiding eye contact with the other volunteers. Days passed, and Ms. Griffin's attitude remained cold. She did her work without complaint, but also without enthusiasm. It wasn't until the third week that something began to change. An elderly man approached her as she was serving soup. His clothes were worn, and his eyes were tired. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. "This meal means more than you know." Ms. Griffin paused, truly looking at him for the first time. She saw the gratitude in his eyes, and something stirred within her. As the weeks went on, Ms. Griffin found herself listening to the stories of those who came to the center. She heard tales of job loss, illness, and misfortune. Slowly, she began to realize that many of these people weren't so different from her. One day, a young mother came in with 2 small children. Ms. Griffin overheard her explaining to Mr. Price that she had lost her job and was struggling to make ends meet. Without thinking, Ms. Griffin approached them. "I used to work in human resources," she said hesitantly. "Perhaps I could help you update your resume?" The young mother's face lit up with hope. "Really, that would be wonderful." As Ms. Griffin sat down with the woman, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt truly useful, truly needed. Over time, Ms. Griffin's demeanor softened. She began to greet the regulars by name, asking about their lives and offering words of encouragement. The resentment that had once filled her heart began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose and connection. Over the next few months, Ms. Griffin's dedication to her community service grew stronger with each passing day. She arrived at the center early, often staying late to help with extra tasks. Her once reluctant attitude had transformed into genuine enthusiasm for the work she was doing. As she served meals and chatted with the center's visitors, Ms. Griffin began to hear stories that opened her eyes to the harsh realities of drug addiction. She listened intently as recovering addicts shared their struggles, their pain, and their hopes for a better future. One afternoon, a young man named Alex approached her. His eyes were sunken, and his hands shook slightly as he accepted a bowl of soup. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm trying to get clean, you know. It's not easy, but this place, it helps." Ms. Griffin felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of John and the terrible accusation she had made. "I'm glad you're getting help, Alex," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're very brave." As the weeks passed, Miss Griffin found herself thinking more and more about the harm she had caused. She saw firsthand how a single act of prejudice could shatter lives and destroy trust. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her conscience. During a group session at the center, Ms. Griffin listened as a woman shared her experience of being wrongly accused of a crime. The pain in the woman's voice was palpable, and Ms. Griffin felt a wave of shame wash over her. "I lost my job, my friends, and even my family doubted me," the woman said, tears glistening in her eyes. "It took years to rebuild my life." Ms. Griffin's hands trembled as she remembered John's face on the day of his arrest. She realized now the full extent of the damage she had caused, not just to John and his mother, but to the entire community. As she continued her work at the center, Ms. Griffin's perspective began to shift. She saw the humanity in every person who walked through the doors, regardless of their background or circumstances. The prejudices that had once clouded her judgment began to fade, replaced by empathy and understanding. As Ms. Griffin continued her work at the community center, the weight of her past actions began to press heavily on her heart. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying the events that had led to John's wrongful arrest. The memory of his frightened face as the police led him away haunted her dreams. One quiet afternoon, as she sorted through donated clothing, Ms. Griffin's hands began to tremble. She sank onto a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. Tears welled up in her eyes as she finally allowed herself to confront the truth. "What was I thinking?" she whispered to herself, her voice choked with emotion. "I hurt that poor boy. All because of my own stupid fears." The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Her prejudice, born from years of isolation and misunderstanding, had nearly destroyed an innocent child's life. She thought of John's kind smile, his willingness to help others, and felt a deep shame wash over her. Ms. Griffin wiped her eyes with shaking hands. She knew that simply feeling sorry wasn't enough. She had to do something to make things right. "I can't change the past," she murmured, her voice growing stronger with resolve. "But I can try to make the future better." In that moment, Ms. Griffin made a decision. She would dedicate herself not just to completing her community service, but to truly making amends. She would work to rebuild the trust she had broken, not only with John and his mother, but with the entire neighborhood. The next day, Ms. Griffin approached the center's director with an idea. She wanted to organize a community outreach program, focusing on bringing people of different backgrounds together. Her hands shook slightly as she outlined her plan, but her voice was steady and determined. Ms. Griffin took a deep breath as she stood outside John and Ms. Harris's front door. Her heart raced, and her palms felt clammy. She had rehearsed her words countless times, but now that the moment had arrived, she felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. Gathering her courage, she knocked softly on the door. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Ms. Harris opened it, her expression guarded. "Ms. Harris," Ms. Griffin began, her voice trembling slightly. I was hoping I could speak with you and John for a moment." Ms. Harris hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let Ms. Griffin enter. John was sitting on the couch, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw who had come to visit. Ms. Griffin stood awkwardly in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know I've caused you both so much pain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I understand if you can never forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry for what I did and I want to make things right." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can show you that I've changed. I heard that John often volunteers at the community center, and I was wondering if it would be okay with both of you, if I could volunteer there too." John and Ms. Harris exchanged a surprised glance. Ms. Griffin hurried on. "I know it's a lot to ask, and if you're not comfortable with the idea, I completely understand. But I want to prove that I'm not the same person I was before. I want to learn and grow and maybe even help others the way John does." Tears welled up in Ms. Griffin's eyes as she looked at John. "You've always been such a kind and helpful young man, John. I was too blinded by my own prejudice to see that before. But now, I hope I can learn from your example." John and Ms. Harris looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. The pain of the past still lingered, but they could see the sincerity in Ms. Griffin's eyes. After a moment, Ms. Harris turned to Ms. Griffin with a soft sigh. "We appreciate your honesty, Ms. Griffin," she said carefully. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and to try to make things right." John nodded, his expression thoughtful. I think it would be okay if you volunteered with us," he said slowly. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Ms. Griffin's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I'll do my best to prove that your trust isn't misplaced." The following week, Miss Griffin joined John and Miss Harris at the community center. At first, the atmosphere was tense and awkward. John and Miss Harris were cautious, and Miss Griffin felt out of place. But as they worked together, sorting donations and preparing meals for those in need, the ice began to thaw. Ms. Griffin watched in awe as John patiently helped an elderly man learn to use a computer. His kindness and patience were evident in every interaction. She felt a pang of regret for how badly she had misjudged him. As the weeks passed, their time together at the community center became more comfortable. Ms. Griffin found herself looking forward to their volunteer shifts. She began to see the world through new eyes, recognizing the strength and resilience in the people she once feared or dismissed. One day, as they were cleaning up after a busy afternoon, Ms. Harris noticed Ms. Griffin struggling with a heavy box. Without hesitation, she went over to help. "Here, let me give you a hand with that," Ms. Harris said, lifting one end of the box. Ms. Griffin looked surprised, then grateful. "Thank you," she said softly. As they worked side by side, Ms. Griffin felt a warmth in her chest. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was a start. She glanced over at John, who was laughing with another volunteer, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As the weeks turned into months, the community began to take notice of Ms. Griffin's transformation. The elderly woman, who had once been known for her prejudice and isolation, was now a regular fixture at the community center, working alongside John and Ms. Harris with a newfound sense of purpose. At first, the neighbors were skeptical. They watched from afar, whispering among themselves about Ms. Griffin's sudden change of heart. But as time passed, even the most doubtful began to see the sincerity in her efforts. Mrs. Johnson, who lived across the street from Ms. Griffin, was one of the first to come around. She had initially sided with Ms. Griffin during the ordeal with John, but now she found herself reassessing her views. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Johnson decided to visit the community center. She watched in amazement as Ms. Griffin patiently taught a group of elderly residents how to use smartphones to connect with their grandchildren. "I never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Johnson muttered to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. More and more residents began to drop by the community center, curious to see Ms. Griffin's transformation for themselves. They were greeted by the sight of the once reclusive woman working tirelessly alongside John and Ms. Harris, her face etched with determination and, surprisingly, joy. Mr. Thompson, the retired teacher who had been vocal in his criticism of Ms. Griffin, found himself reassessing his stance. He watched as Ms. Griffin helped a young immigrant family navigate the complexities of job applications, her patience and kindness evident in every interaction. "Well, I'll be," Mr. Thompson said, turning to his wife. "Looks like people really can change." As the neighborhood witnessed Ms. Griffin's genuine efforts to make amends, the atmosphere began to shift. The tension that had divided the community started to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of unity and hope. The sun was setting on a crisp autumn evening when a police cruiser pulled up in front of John and Ms. Harris's modest home. The sight of the vehicle made John's heart race, memories of his wrongful arrest still fresh in his mind. Ms. Harris placed a comforting hand on her son's shoulder, her eyes filled with concern and determination. The police chief, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped out of the car. He approached the house with slow, deliberate steps, his face etched with regret. As he reached the front porch, Ms. Harris opened the door, her expression guarded. "Good evening, Ms. Harris, John," the police chief said, his voice soft but firm. "I was hoping we could talk for a moment." Ms. Harris nodded, inviting him inside. They settled in the living room, the tension palpable in the air. John sat close to his mother, drawing strength from her presence. The police chief took a deep breath before speaking. "I've come here today to offer my sincerest apologies for the trauma you both endured due to John's wrongful arrest. What happened was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my department." John and Ms. Harris exchanged glances, surprised by the chief's candor. The man continued, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "We failed you and we failed this community. The pain and distress we caused can never be fully undone, but I want you to know that we are committed to doing better." Ms. Harris leaned forward, her eyes meeting the chief's. "What steps are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen to another innocent person?" The police chief nodded, acknowledging the importance of her question. "We're implementing new training programs focused on bias awareness and community relations. We're also establishing a civilian oversight committee to review our practices and hold us accountable." He turned to John, his expression softening. "John, I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. You did nothing wrong, and you didn't deserve any of this." John felt a lump form in his throat, touched by the chief's words. Ms. Harris squeezed her son's hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The police chief continued, "We're committed to working closely with the community to rebuild trust and prevent such incidents from occurring in the future. We want to be partners in creating a safer, more just neighborhood for everyone." As summer bloomed, the community center buzzed with excitement. Colorful banners fluttered in the warm breeze, and the aroma of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air. Neighbors of all ages gathered for a special event, their faces bright with anticipation. Inside, John stood nervously beside his mother, Ms. Harris. Across the room, Ms. Griffin fidgeted with the hem of her blouse, her eyes darting around uncertainly. The once divided trio now shared a common purpose, united by their journey of healing and growth. The community center's director, a jovial woman named Mrs. Peterson, stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome, everyone," she beamed. "Today, we're here to celebrate 3 very special individuals who have shown us the true meaning of forgiveness and community spirit." As Mrs. Peterson spoke about their contributions, John felt a warmth spread through his chest. He glanced at his mother, who squeezed his hand and smiled proudly. Ms. Griffin caught his eye from across the room, offering a small, grateful nod. "First, we'd like to honor John Harris," Mrs. Peterson announced. "This young man's resilience and kindness in the face of adversity have been an inspiration to us all." The room erupted in applause as John shyly made his way to the stage. He accepted a certificate, his cheeks flushing with emotion. Next, Ms. Harris was called up. "Cynthia Harris has shown us the power of a mother's love and the strength of unwavering faith," Mrs. Peterson declared. Ms. Harris's eyes glistened as she received her award, the crowd's cheers echoing her impact on the community. Finally, it was Ms. Griffin's turn. A hush fell over the room as she slowly approached the stage. "Martha Griffin," Mrs. Peterson began, her voice gentle, "has demonstrated that it's never too late to change, to learn, and to make amends. Her journey reminds us all of the importance of growth and redemption." As Ms. Griffin accepted her certificate, her hands trembling slightly, the audience broke into applause. Many who had once turned their backs on her now stood, offering a standing ovation. Tears streamed down Ms. Griffin's face as she looked out at the forgiving faces of her neighbors. The 3 honorees stood together on the stage, a living testament to the power of forgiveness and community. As they gazed out at the sea of smiling faces, they saw not just neighbors, but a family, one that had weathered storms and emerged stronger for it. If you enjoyed the story of John and Ms. Griffin, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.